Tonight, we descend into the living labyrinth of the Maya, into the white roads known as Sacbeob, into the engineered jungle, into the hidden highways that stitch together one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world, because beneath the canopy of Mesoamerica, under roots and soil and centuries of forgetting, lies something extraordinary. Not isolated cities swallowed by wilderness, but a system, a circulatory network of stone and intention. Like every network humanity has ever built, carried both power and fragility within the same structure. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, echoes of forgotten lore. There is a particular quality to the light just before dawn in the Yucatan Peninsula. It does not arrive so much. As it seeps, filtering through a canopy so dense and ancient that the forest floor remains in a kind of perpetual dusk even at midday. And yet, if you were standing on certain stretches of elevated stone path 1,000 years ago, the darkness would have been different. Beneath your feet, a surface of crushed and compacted limestone bound with lime plaster so fine and so carefully maintained that it would have reflected the earliest light like the surface of still water. Before you, a road that stretched in a nearly perfect straight line for kilometers, cutting through jungle, over wetlands, across the uneven topography of a landscape that was never supposed to permit such things. To walk that road would have been to feel, unmistakably, that you were not moving through nature. We're moving through a civilization's declaration of itself. These roads are called Sacbeob, a Yucatec Maya word meaning simply white roads. The singular is sac, and though the word is simple, what it describes is anything but. The construction of a sact was not a casual undertaking. These were not dirt tracks worn smooth by repeated passage, the kind of path that emerges organically wherever enough feet travel the same route over enough generations. The Sacbeob were deliberately engineered raised causeways, elevated anywhere from half a meter to more than 2 meters above the surrounding terrain. Built atop a rubble core of limestone fill, their surfaces finished with a thick layer of lime plaster that ancient builders likely kept brilliant white through periodic renewal. The width of these roads varied, but many of the major interurban causeways measured between 4 and 12 meters across, wide enough for large processions, the movement of goods, for the kind of ceremonial travel that requires an audience and a stage. The engineering challenges were considerable. The Yucatan is not flat in the way that maps make it appear. It is riddled with sinkholes, threaded with seasonal swamps, broken by ridges of exposed karst limestone. To build a straight elevated road across this terrain required not only labor on a substantial scale, and we are talking about labor organized in the tens or hundreds of thousands of person-hours, but also a sophisticated understanding of hydrology, of drainage, of how water moves beneath and across a limestone substrate. The Maya were not guessing, they were calculating. The lime plaster itself tells a story. Producing it required burning enormous quantities of limestone in kilns, a process that consumed significant amounts of wood. Each resurfacing of a major sack represented a deliberate investment of fuel, labor, and organizational capacity. When archaeologists find evidence of multiple plaster layers on the same stretch of road, they are reading a record of sustained institutional commitment, of a polity that returned, again and again, to maintain a piece of infrastructure over centuries. This was not infrastructure built for convenience. This was infrastructure built to mean something. Of all the Sacbeob so far identified, and researchers have cataloged well over 50 within the boundaries of the ancient Maya lowlands alone, one stands apart for its scale, its ambition, and the questions it continues to raise. The Sacbeob, connecting Cobá, in what is now the state of Quintana Roo in Mexico, to the site of Yaxuná, approximately 100 kilometers to the west, is the longest single ancient road yet confirmed in the pre-Columbian Americas. 100 kilometers. Built in a nearly straight line, elevated above the jungle floor, surfaced with white plaster, connecting to significant Maya centers across some of the most ecologically complex terrain in Mesoamerica. When archaeologists and epigraphers began to piece together the political landscape of the northern Yucatan, Cobá was a powerful and expansive polity. At its height, it controlled a network of subsidiary sites connected by its own internal system of Sacbeob. some of which radiate outward from Cobá's ceremonial core like spokes from a hub. The city's monumental architecture, including pyramid structures that remain among the tallest in the northern lowlands, reflects a center with resources, ambitions, and a long political reach. Yaxuná, at the western terminus of the Great Causeway, is a different kind of site, smaller, strategically positioned, historically contested. Ceramic sequences and architectural evidence suggest that Yaxuná changed hands more than once over the centuries. And some researchers have interpreted the Cobá and Yaxuná causeway as in part a political instrument, a physical expression of Cobá's sphere of influence, a way of projecting presence across the landscape before the rival city of Chichén. It arose to dominance and eventually absorbed the western part of that network entirely. The road in this reading was not merely a transport corridor. It was a territorial argument made in stone, and it worked for a time. The maintenance of such a road required that the communities along its length remain within Cobá's political and economic orbit. Conversely, those communities likely depended on the road for access to goods, to ceremonial centers, to the broader network of exchange that made complex urban life possible. The road created mutual dependency, which means that when the balance of regional power shifted, when Chichén, Itza, expanded westward, and the Cobá network began to contract, the road's abandonment was not just the loss of a transport link, it was the collapse of a relationship. For most of the modern era of Maya archaeology, what we knew about the Sacbeob came from what we could see on the surface, or could deduce through painstaking ground survey in conditions that defeated the patience of all but the most determined researchers. The jungle conceals, root systems disturb. Centuries of accumulated organic matter bury even substantial stone structures under a blanket of soil and vegetation thick, enough that an elevated roadway can become indistinguishable from a natural ridge. LiDAR changed this. Light detection and ranging technology, in which an aircraft or drone emits millions of laser pulses toward the ground and precisely measures their return times, can, when processed correctly, strip away the digital representation of vegetation and reveal the bare topography beneath. When researchers began applying LiDAR surveys to Maya sites in the late 2000s, and then on an increasingly large scale through the 2010s, what they found rewrote the terms of the conversation. At Caracol in Belize, a single LiDAR survey revealed a city that covered nearly 170 square kilometers. With an internal causeway system connecting neighborhoods, agricultural terraces, and secondary centers in a pattern that no ground survey had come close to capturing. At sites in Guatemala's Petén region, LiDAR surveys conducted under the auspices of the Pakinam LiDAR Initiative, a multi-institutional collaboration announced in 2018, identified more than 60,000 previously unknown structures across 2,100 square kilometers. Among them, fortifications, agricultural infrastructure, and roads connecting sites that had never before been identified as related. What emerged from these surveys was not merely a quantitative revision, more sites, more roads, more structures. It was a qualitative one. The Maya lowlands, viewed through LiDAR, did not resemble a mosaic of isolated city-states surrounded by empty jungle. They resembled something closer to a continuously inhabited, continuously managed landscape, an engineered environment in which the distinction between urban and rural was far less absolute than earlier models had assumed. The Sacbeob in this new picture were not exceptional. They were the visible filaments of a much denser connective tissue. This brings us to a concept that has become increasingly central to Maya studies in the past 2 decades, and which represents one of the more significant shifts in how researchers understand the pre-Columbian world: the idea of the engineered landscape. The Maya did not simply inhabit the jungle, they transformed it. Over centuries, they modified drainage patterns by constructing raised fields and canal systems in wetland areas, converting zones that would otherwise have been seasonally inaccessible into some of the most productive agricultural land in Mesoamerica. They managed forest composition through cultivation of economically and ritually important species. They constructed reservoirs and water management systems, sophisticated enough to sustain large urban populations through the pronounced dry season that characterizes much of the Maya lowlands. The Sacbeob were part of this transformation, not separate from it, but continuous with it. A road that crosses a wetland is also a water management feature, altering drainage and creating ecological edges that can themselves be exploited. A road that connects multiple ceremonial centers is also a spine along which markets can cluster, along which agricultural surplus can move, along which the political authority of a ruling dynasty can be made. Physically present in the landscape of its subjects' daily lives, to the Maya, the distinction between the built and the natural environment was not the same distinction we tend to make. Their cosmos was relational, a web of correspondences between the human, agricultural, the celestial, and the underworld. A white road cutting through dark forest was not just civil engineering, it was a cosmological statement. An alignment of the human world with forces and patterns that extended far beyond any individual polity's political horizon. The road was a thread in a much larger weaving. There is a particular irony embedded in the history of the Sacbeob, and it is worth sitting with it. The same characteristics that made the Maya road network a source of strength: its extent, its density, its capacity to move goods, people, and political authority across large distances, also introduced vulnerabilities that would prove, under certain conditions, catastrophic. Complex, interconnected systems are resilient against small, localized disruptions. A drought that affects one node in a network can be buffered by supply from elsewhere. A political crisis in one polity can be absorbed without destabilizing the whole, provided the connections between nodes remain functional. This is the deep logic of interconnection. It distributes risk. But interconnected systems are also susceptible to cascading failures. When the disruption is not localized but systemic, when drought affects the entire region simultaneously, when political instability spreads along the very corridors that were built to facilitate cooperation, the connections that once protected can become conduits for collapse. The archaeologist Arthur Demarest and others who have studied the terminal classic collapse have noted that the highly integrated political economy of the classic Maya may have amplified, rather than dampened, the crises of the 9th century. When the exchange networks failed, they failed broadly. The sites that persisted longest were often those with the most diversified local resource bases. Those, in other words, that had maintained a degree of independence from the network even while participating in it. The roads did not cause the collapse, but they did shape its character, the speed with which disruption propagated, the degree to which the fortunes of distant cities became entangled with one another, the difficulty of maintaining political legitimacy when the material flows that underwrote that legitimacy began to dry up. A living organism that grows too dependent on any single circulatory system becomes fragile in ways its apparent strength obscures. We often think of infrastructure as just inert stuff: roads, aqueducts, fiber optic cables. We see them as passive conduits, neutral vessels for human activity. But the ancient Maya Sacbeob, or white roads, tell a different story. Infrastructure shapes us. It doesn't just respond to how we move and trade, it creates those patterns, reinforcing them, making certain interactions easy and others hard. Take the causeway between the Maya cities of Cobá and Yaxuná. It wasn't just a reflection of their political bond. It deepened that relationship, stretched it across time, and made it real for everyone who traveled it. And when that bond broke, the road made the collapse all the more significant. Over centuries, a road accumulates meaning. When it's been traveled by merchants, pilgrims, armies, and mourners, it's more than just a transportation system. It's a record of human purpose. It carries the story of a society's spatial imagination. What places matter? What relationships are worth sustaining? And what kind of world they're trying to build? In this sense, the Maya Sacbeob were alive. Not in a mystical way, but in a real, systemic way. They were maintained, they grew, and shrank. They responded to their environment. When conditions changed too much, they ceased to be. Their abandonment wasn't a failure of memory. It was a clear response to forces that overwhelmed the ability to maintain them. What they left behind aren't just ruins. They left a landscape that still bears the imprint of a civilization trying to organize itself across space and time. You can see it in the topography, in the soil, even in the plants that grow along the old road corridors. Today, we live in a world of infrastructure that would be almost incomprehensible to a classic Maya engineer, yet the logic behind it would feel entirely familiar. We've built connections of incredible density and reach. Goods cross the planet in days, information in seconds. We've woven the fates of distant societies into a web so intricate that it's hard to trace the impact of any single disruption. In other words, we've built our own Sacbeob. And just like the Maya roads, ours carry both the strength and the fragility of interconnection. The lesson from this living labyrinth isn't a simple warning about complexity. The Maya were not naive. Their incredible engineering and centuries-long management of a tough environment proved they understood the challenges of large-scale systems. The real lesson is more subtle. Connections we build are not neutral. Encode our assumptions about how the world works, what relationships we value, and what we're willing to invest to be part of something larger. These assumptions can be durable, or they can be brittle. For centuries, the white roads of the Maya were among the most remarkable expressions of human organization in the ancient world. But eventually, they were surrendered back to the jungle. What remains isn't a monument to failure. It's a record of ambition, of a civilization's sustained effort to hold itself together, to make the world make sense, to transform the dark forest into something that glowed, even briefly, with human purpose. The jungle grew back, it always does. But the roads are still there, under the roots, waiting for the next instrument precise enough to find them. The Sacbeob were never meant to be monuments. They were arteries. They carried trade and tribute, pilgrims and messengers, authority and belief. They carried the invisible architecture of a civilization that understood something we are still learning. Connection is power, but connection is also responsibility. The white roads of the Maya did not fail because they were primitive. They endured for centuries because they were sophisticated, organized, and deeply intentional. And when they were finally surrendered back to the forest, it was not because the Maya lacked intelligence or vision. It was because the systems that sustained them had shifted beyond recovery. The jungle reclaimed the stone, but the pattern remains. Today, we build our own living labyrinths, networks of fiber and steel, roads and satellites, supply chains and digital corridors that bind distant cities into a single shared rhythm. Like the Maya, we rely on those connections to move not just goods, but meaning, identity, stability. The question is not whether we will build networks. The question is whether we understand what they require to endure. If this descent into the hidden highways of the ancient world has resonated with you, I invite you to continue the journey. Subscribe to Whispered Chronicles, Echoes of Forgotten Lore, and join our growing circle of observers as we trace the patterns civilizations leave behind in stone, in ash, in dust, and beneath the roots of the forest. I'd like to hear from you. If you could walk one of those white roads at dawn, knowing what we now know, what do you think it would feel like? Would it inspire confidence or caution? Share your thoughts below. Your reflections are part of what keeps these whispers alive. Thank you for spending this time in the labyrinth with me. Until the next whisper, stay curious and stay safe.